Welcome everybody to our second panel, Building Resilient Ecosystems. If you were here for the first panel, welcome back. And if you're just coming in for the first time, just welcome. I will reintroduce myself for those who weren't here for the first panel. My name is Shasta Gaughan. I am the Environmental Director and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Palma Band of Mission Indians in northern San Diego County, California, on Payom-Kawachum traditional territory. So I'm glad you're all here to be with us to meet these 5 amazing panelists. On this panel, we're talking about how the changing climate is impacting our ecosystems and what are some of the things that we're doing to increase the resilience of our natural places. That ranges from saving species from climate impacts, understanding ecosystem connectivity under different climate regimes, and to look at the cultural impacts of shifting ecosystems and species, or using photography as a way to shed light on those ecosystems. So I'm going to go in the order we're showing here on the slide for our introductions, and so we'll start with Dr. Sula Vanderplank.
Thank you, Shasta, and hi everybody. I'm Sula Vanderplank. I am the new Director of Terrestrial Ecosystem Conservation for Per Natura Noroeste. And I'm going to try and speak slowly and remember for the translation. So I have spent the last 15 years working on the Baja California Peninsula, mostly issues centered around biodiversity conservation with an emphasis in botany. And I just took over a brand new program at Per Natura Noroeste. So I now work throughout all of northwestern Mexico for ecosystem conservation on a large scale. And so one of the things we're trying to build in from the very beginning is how to address climate change and build climate resilience into our existing reserves. We have reserves all around the peninsula and throughout northwestern Mexico as well. And so I'm really pleased to have so many fantastic collaborators for this. We work with all sorts of different ecosystems and habitats, from mangroves. We also work in the US-Mexico borderlands. We work in freshwater river systems, and we have lots of new programs that we're putting together. But this program was born this year, so it's very new. And yeah, we've got climate at the forefront of that. Some of my history is working in particular with fog. I'm particularly interested personally in how fog affects our ecosystems and how species respond to fog.
Great, thank you, Sula. And now the slide is gone, so I'm just going to go in whatever order I feel like it, and I'm going to throw it over to Megan Jennings.
Thank you, Shasta. Good morning, I'm Megan Jennings. I am a research ecologist at San Diego State University, and I'm also the co-director of the Institute for Ecological Monitoring and Management at San Diego State. And I think the mission statement, or the tagline of the Institute, IEMM as we call it, really epitomizes the way that I approach the science that I do and how I think about conservation, land management, and how we address climate and climate adaptation. And that tagline is science in service of policy and management. And really science in service, like you could ... you can leave an ellipsis there and add on any sort of service that we can provide with science. I'm very interested in that. And that all comes from my background. I wasn't a scientist to start, no one is, right? We become these things with years of training. But I came to science with a land management background. I spent over a decade working in land management here in San Diego County with the Cleveland National Forest, being a biologist on the ground, learning about our species, about our habitats. And one of the reasons I came to science, why I wanted to be a researcher, is to help answer those challenging questions of how do we best manage these places, these species, our interactions, to make them better, to improve what we're doing. And from being on that side of thinking about these things where you need answers or you need science to help inform the way that you proceed, that's how I've approached my science as I've become a researcher. And all the research questions that I ask are really focusing on actionable science. How can this inform what we do, the challenges that we face, and really using science to help answer those questions. And more recently, I've been thinking about how to answer those questions and focusing not just on the science, but on communicating on who we're trying to reach, broadening our audiences, and incorporating different perspectives. And that's been something really exciting for me lately. My background is in wildlife movement, landscape connectivity planning. How can animals get across the landscape? How can we best conserve land, with strategies that make sure that it's functional for biodiversity and for wildlife movement? And initially I was focused on the species and the habitats, but the more I started to work in it, the more I saw it was really about the communities. It's about the land manager community, and then it's about the conservation community. But then I started to see that there were barriers to accomplishing what we wanted to accomplish by only focusing on those smaller groups. And really, we have to broaden our net, broaden our perspectives. And that comes from asking and listening from a wide variety of audiences. And so that's part of the work I've been doing more recently, to focus on not just landscape connectivity, but how conservation planning and the work that we do to help with climate adaptation needs to incorporate these different perspectives. So instead of just thinking about conservation as a separate practice, integrating that into how we think about protecting our communities from climate change, and all communities, working with our local tribal communities and thinking about how they approach thinking about the land, which is very different than the Western conservation practice and the Western scientist practice. And so that's one of the reasons I'm here, is not just to talk about how I think about it, because I'm of course informed by my unique perspective as a prior land manager, as someone who was just crazy interested in wildlife and conservation, but now listening to other voices and incorporating them into the work that I do so that the conservation can be more meaningful. It can serve our communities as well as our ecosystems, and we can be better integrated and more effective at what we're trying to do.
All right, thank you, Megan. And I'm going to switch it over to Charlie De La Rosa next.
Thanks, Shasta. So I'm Charlie. I'm the Natural Lands Program Manager for San Diego Zoo Global. So I'm based out of the Institute for Conservation Research, which is in the Safari Park campus near Escondido. And so in this position, I get to wear a lot of different hats, which is pretty exciting. I'm an ecologist by training. I got my PhD at UCLA 2 years ago in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And my research interests are basically human impacts on ecosystems, especially through domestic and invasive species. Like Megan, before I came to science, I had about a half a decade's worth of experience working in conservation land management. I mostly did invasive plant and animal management on Catalina Island. And not to go too much into ancient history, but my dad's a biologist as well. And so it's kind of the family business. We moved to Costa Rica when I was 6 years old and lived on different field stations in the Northwestern province for about 10 years. And so it's something that I'm really motivated by conservation, and it's kind of my passion. I'm really interested in pragmatic and practical solutions to big conservation questions. I'm kind of ideologically flexible, and I really like to put myself into other people's shoes and think about what their motivations are, what their biases are, if I disagree with them, and especially if I agree with them. So that's just kind of like a bit of my conservation philosophy. So in my current position, I get to do, I have a small research program. We do a whole bunch of different stuff, ranging from looking at the effect of different herbicides on target and non-target species, seed germination trials for invasive species that pose a threat to biodiversity in the lands that we're in charge of. And we're also doing some cool kind of population biology work with red diamond rattlesnakes and other native species. But mostly what I end up doing is conservation land management. So that's just basically prioritizing threats, coming up with land management plans and doing a lot of outreach and working with it in an advisory capacity for other nonprofits and organizations in both the Southern California and Northwestern Mexico. So that's just a bit about me.
Great, thank you, Charlie. And now we're going to go to Mirna Borrego Lazalde. I hope I said that right.
Está perfecto, it's perfect. Hola a todos. Hi everyone. My name is Mirna Borrego and I'm the Educational Services Officer Terra Peninsular. And we are a nonprofit organization that works in Baja California, here in Ensenada, dedicated to environmental conservation. Terra Peninsular was founded in 2001 and in Baja California. And in this position, I work with community outreach, very near from the communities that live surrounding and in the middle of the natural reserves that we protect. Sorry if I see two screens, I have two screens to see. In this position, my goal is to connect the nature with the community with nature. And I work very near with the young people from the communities and the students. And the thing that I want to do is to connect these people with the value of the land, and through experiences and a lot of art and education and educational activities. Mostly I coordinate and design an annual bird festival in San Quintin Bay in Ensenada and also here in Ensenada. And that's all. I'm not a biologist. I study communication and science population. I love nature, and that's what I do. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mirna. And then now we've got Conor Mcgee.
Thank you, Shasta Miyuyam. My name is Conor Mcgee. I'm from the Palma Band of Mission Indians on Luceño and Cahuilla. And if that sounds familiar, it's because when Shasta introduced herself, we're fortunate enough to have Shasta at our tribe heading 2 departments. So we work closely together sometimes, which is awesome, like today, for instance. And I'm also the Research and Data Applications Manager at the Climate Science Alliance. And I've spent the past few years really focusing on, well, 2 projects, but mainly one in the Palma Valley at the Palma Tribal Farms. And gosh, throughout that time, it's been interfacing with state agencies, federal agencies, UC Cooperative Extension, implementing a whole slew of conservation practices and demonstrating their value in sequestering carbon and mitigating greenhouse gases. And prior to that, I worked with the National Resource Conservation Service through a joint contract with the Intertribal Agricultural Council, working on tribal projects throughout the state. And the last project at the Palma Tribal Farms brought me to CSA, where I'm able to work with the Climate Science Alliance's partners in developing land-based solutions. And and I still just get to do all the things that I love doing. All of it stems from my sort of passion and curiosity, playing in the chaparral and coastal sage scrubs of our reservation. I really just think that the riverbeds of our reservation raised me, playing in the willows and climbing the oaks. And I just have a profound connection with that environment. And I see it as the solution to our problems, the teacher. And so that's where my path in life has taken me. And I just feel so fortunate every day when I get to be on panels like this and listen to Megan, Jennings, and Sula and Charlie. I just feel really humbled. There's a lot to talk about. I'll wait for the next discussion to come up. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Conor. And I want to, on a personal note, say that I'm humbled and I'm grateful for the opportunities that Paula has given me, since I am not a tribal citizen or a tribal member anywhere. And it's been so wonderful to be able to work with tribal members like Conor and so many of his family and friends on the reservation. So thank you for that. And it's amazing to be able to work with you also as a colleague for the Alliance. So I want to start with both Sula and Myrna to acknowledge that you are on the other side of the border. And of course, we all know that the border is porous, not only for people, but for ecosystems. And so I would like to hear from both of you, and we'll start with Sula, about how you see your work being affected by this international border.
You know, that's such a great question, and there's so many challenges, not just in the presence of a physical border, but lately just difficulty with scientists being able to move through that border, and communications and collaboration being challenged by the presence of that border. For us specifically too, we actually have a reserve that's part of a binational habitat corridor where wall construction is set to begin shortly, and so there's some very direct habitat impacts that we're trying to deal with and think about, you know, what we can do about invasive species and climate resilience on reserves. But I think it's so important, and I'm so grateful that we're having a binational conversation, that we continue to be a binational community, that we find ways, you know, to make that porous border, at least in our academic pursuits and our conservation pursuits, and how we think about these problems. And yeah, thank you for creating spaces like this where we can talk about the land both sides of the border.
Of course. And Myrna, same question. How are you seeing the border as being any sort of an impediment, or maybe even a benefit to the work that you do?
Yeah, I see a lot of benefits with the organizations that we work together. So there is a lot of support from different organizations in the United States that understand the value of our lands. And I think this is very important for us, because when people cross the border and visit and go to the lands, and the people near and the people that live there see that kind of enthusiastic people that say all the time, like, oh my God, you have this amazing land, you need to protect it, I want to share, I want to do something, I want to help. I think they feel motivating, and they starting like making questions about their own lands. Yeah.
And that question actually extends to tribal landscapes as well. So I want to bring Conor, and actually for Megan too, because you're doing connectivity between different ecosystems, so it all applies. But you know, Conor, we know that the tribal borders, the reservation borders, number one, they don't entirely encompass the traditional areas of the people who are now, you know, confined within the reservation borders from a political standpoint. But how do you see the ecosystem work or the sequestration work that you do transcending those borders between tribal communities and the outside communities?
I see it happening more and more now, and I think there's a larger recognition for place-based science that we see happening. And when I say place-based science, I'm talking about our communities that have lived here and thrived here and worked with the environment and employed the scientific method, and have the greatest wealth of knowledge of our ecosystems, let's say in the Palma Valley, and the more that we kind of drop those barriers down, whether they're political or cultural, and just transcend into human knowledge, and using that as the most effective tool to mitigate against climate change, to sequester carbon, to draw down nitrogen in the atmosphere, to increase connectivity. Once we're able to do that, I think that's one of the hopeful things that I see happening as far as crossing borders.
And Megan, similar question for you, but you're talking about connectivity within ecosystems in general. And tell us a little bit about your work with bringing tribes and other communities into that process.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. When I was hearing Sula and Mirna talk, I was thinking about, how do we think about connectivity? And, a lot of it's about what are barriers to the landscape. And, we draw these geopolitical boundaries, but to ecosystems and to species and to climate change, they mean nothing, except for when we actually put up physical barriers to affect connectivity. And, one of the things is I worry about those barriers that we construct to delineate our territories and to separate things that we feel should be separated in our communities or in our cultures. But I think the real hope is, just like Mirna was talking about, feeling inspired by communities wanting to come together. That's a place where I see hope and opportunity, and that's where we've been trying to build. I've been doing work on connectivity in Southern California for a while now, and more recently have been trying to, as I mentioned in my introduction, really trying to bring more perspectives to the work that I do, helping inform beyond my personal perspective. How do we think about connectivity? How can we engage with communities and serve not just ecosystems, because we are not isolated, thinking about just ecosystems. Humans and ecosystems interact. So we need to address that in the connectivity. So, in addition to trying to think about working across the US-Mexico border, because those ecosystems are connected, also making sure that some of this important knowledge that Conor was just talking about, this historical place-based knowledge that is so rich with tribes and a culture of coexisting, of appreciating, of stewarding the land in a way that is not ingrained in Western culture the way that it is in indigenous communities. How can we learn from that? How can we benefit from modeling similar practices? And also, how can we better honor not just tribal reservation boundaries, but the fact that all lands are tribal lands, are indigenous lands, and give opportunity to engage and have all perspectives represented on all of these lands, because it matters. And we all have a perspective that will help, I think, improve our actions and advance our successes, towards these ends of being more connected, better conserved, and better prepared to adapt.
Thank you, Megan. And I'm actually going to bring it to Charlie, but Charlie, I'm going to broaden it even more. You are on the spot because you work for San Diego Zoo Global. So let's talk about resilient ecosystems on a global basis. You're working for a place that is looking to preserve and protect species that are endangered from ecosystems all over the world. So how do you see this whole conversation from a global perspective?
That's a big question.
Yes, it is.
I guess I'm kind of lucky in that my purview is fairly small compared to that of the entire organization. My focus is here on the local ecosystems. I think that globally, I'm speaking for myself, I think is probably the best thing to do. But globally, we're looking, one of the big questions that motivates me is, how do we do conservation in a world of 10 billion people, and in a world that's going to be continually interconnected and continually global? How do we create space and create connectivity for natural ecosystems in that kind of way? And I'm convinced that integrating people into every aspect of conservation, as opposed to setting up this people and nature kind of dichotomy, is part of the solution. And I think that, so in my work, I think that's been a big focus. I've done research in Sonora with local, basically on cattle ranching in southeastern Sonora, based out of a ranching community. And what I've seen there is that when the community is disrupted and people leave, that change happens. The original guardians, the people that have multi-generational connection to the land, when they leave, then things get a whole lot worse. So there's, I think that's a lesson that's played out over and over again in history, and that we should start to listen to at this point. I think a lot of people on this panel are working really hard on integrating communities and nature in that way.
Thanks, Charlie, and also a personal thanks because you've allowed and arranged for tribal members from Paula and from other communities to come to the, I'm sorry, I'm still going to call it the Wild Animal Park, born and raised in San Diego, and I can't get away from it. It's not the safari park to me, but come in and harvest traditional plants, and that's the traditional lands of the San Pasqual band, Kumeyaay. And yet you've been instrumental in getting folks in to be able to do that harvesting. So, you know, many thanks for that. And, you know, that also acknowledges the, you know, that boundaries have been built around, you know, tribal lands. And so there's been loss of access. So, you know, and again, this is about building resilient ecosystems. So maybe we can bring it back down a little more to focus on each of your individual work on building resilience, and so, and on the effects of climate. So I'm going to circle back to Sula and ask that question: that what do you see as the major climate impacts on the ecosystems where you work right now?
So that's a great question, and my colleagues have definitely been facing this longer than I have, as I'm fairly new in my position. But for example, around Magdalena Bay, where we have our mangroves, we're definitely seeing serious impacts from sea level rise. And so we're seeing a die-off of a part of the mangrove fringe and a shifting of mangroves inland, but the mangroves being lost and the mangroves being recruited aren't necessarily the same species. And so we're definitely seeing losses and gains of not necessarily the same species composition within our mangroves. And so one of the amazing things that they're doing there is working with the community, training local people to be guardians of the mangroves and to look for these areas where change is most occurring. But so the mangroves are one ecosystem where we're certainly seeing impacts. So the first one that springs to mind. Also, just in all of our reserves, I think you're seeing impacts. When we're suffering disturbance, we're seeing invasive species coming in and taking a hold in ways that, you know, might definitely be worse for climate change. That's certainly more of a future concern, but I think we're very worried about what's going to happen with that balance of native and non-native species going forward.
And Myrna, for you, I know with your work with Terra Peninsular, that you've engaged a lot in work with the local communities there, and I imagine that gives you some hope for the future. So could you talk about that for us a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the most important projects for me in my heart is the young club of photographers. These students that they have between 12 and 14 years old. They live near and surrounded by the natural reserves. So yeah, I believe that promoting the using of photography as a tool for conservation is a great opportunity for these children in the community. So I think nature photography is a fundamental and very powerful tool, and because I think it'd be very difficult to show and encourage people to conserve if we don't show what is in danger. So yeah, for me, this work with the club is really amazing. People in the community, they feel very inspired, and now the families want that their children's join the club, and they are more interested in what we do as organization in the natural reserves. So for me, it's a very great journey with this project.
And from a technical standpoint, the photographers, are they using film cameras or their phone cameras?
They start with phone cameras, and after 2 years, and thanks to the U.S. Forest, we can get like 6 professional cameras.
Oh,
yeah, so they are starting taking great pictures, but they have a great eye, so they don't need a professional camera. Yeah, I think they put their soul and they love for and they're interested for the land where they live.
And I believe, and maybe Alex or somebody can put this in the chat, but there
Yeah.
are artworks that are on the website, and the artworks are based on the photography that these kids and students have done. And I personally would think they're amazing and would hang them on my wall. Charlie, you can put them back there with your wildebeest or your okapi or whatever it is that's hanging behind you.
Yeah, they have the first exhibit last year in the last summit in Idlewild Academy, and
Yes.
just two of them have visa, so they can cross the border with a father. He's one of the members of the club too, and all the community was very, very excited, and they was like, "Oh my God, this is serious!" Yeah.
Yeah, so make sure everybody take a look at that on the summit webpage, because it's really beautiful work. Megan, I want to turn back to you, and I love talking about the art and the kids and the education, but I also love the science. So can you tell us some of the key findings so far from your project?
Yeah, well, we have a couple of projects going, and so I'll just give you a little bit of how we got there to for folks who aren't aware, although I talk about this a lot at Climate Science Alliance events, in part because we have such a great partnership that allows us to integrate cool things like artistic representations of our science, which is just so fantastic because it allows us to have such a broad reach compared to writing a scientific paper and putting it in a journal so that only other scientists really want to read it. But I've been working on connectivity planning and thinking about wildlife movement for a long time, and we did this climate resilient connectivity project so we could think about how to integrate climate into our planning. In Southern California, our biggest threat to wildlife movement and a lot of our biodiversity issues are related to habitat fragmentation first and foremost. And then climate change on top of that just exacerbates the issue. So we have to find a way to sort of deal with these competing but also synergistic threats. When they interact is when we're really having problems. Some of the problems that Sula mentioned occur here, and you can open the newspaper and it reads like an intergovernmental panel on climate change report in terms of the things that we're seeing happening. Like they write, here's what we need to worry about, and then here it is in the newspaper, fires and drought, and we don't have hurricanes, but these are the things that are happening. So how do we adapt to that and integrate that into our conservation planning? But in that work to develop a connectivity plan, we really saw that one of the barriers to achieving action was that we were mostly focused on talking to land managers and conservation planners. And really where the rubber meets the road is in land use planning and jurisdictional planning, and that we needed to be better connected, again, this whole connection with the human community. And so we initiated this project because, again, going back to, I think, something I said earlier, and I think almost everyone has touched on it, these different perspectives, also different valuation systems. What do people care about? What do they value? And it doesn't have to be conservation. It can be protecting people from wildfire. It can be worrying about having adequate and clean water to drink, especially folks who live in the backcountry on wells, like many of our tribal communities do. So we put together this really great interdisciplinary project where we could think about connectivity, not only from the ecological perspective, but about how that preserving those lands and valuing natural habitats for all these other benefits that they provide to our human communities can advance conservation. And so really the outcomes of that work, we're still in progress, and we have some great science coming out about, resilience and refuge in a variety of these domains, thinking about fire and water and biodiversity. But I'll say the biggest outcome thus far, with a project that's in progress and we don't have research findings completed, the thing that's really giving me hope and where I've seen fantastic progress, and I think one of the great outcomes is just the interest people are bringing to this, the motivation, the excitement and enthusiasm for this work, for understanding that we're all coming at this from different perspectives or from different value systems, and that's okay. And actually, we're stronger for it. One example is working with the tribal communities, thinking about what are the cultural values of the resources when we protect, that we'll be also protecting if we protect connectivity, important plants for basket making or food resources or important places. So, breaking outside of the normal bounds of the way that we're thinking, and just the way that people have grabbed onto this and been really excited about participating in this and using these results, I think, has been one of the most powerful outcomes thus far. And I'm really excited to see where this goes from here.
So am I. I think we all are. And you mentioned the tribal stuff, which brings me back to Conor and the work that you have done. And can you tell us a little bit about the Palma tribal farms?
Yes, yeah. So let me see if I could span out here. This is a demonstration project. So we're focusing on an 86-acre parcel, and there's 16 acres that are held in for veggie row crop production, which about 3 to 5 of it is put in production year round. And there's about 60 different species that are cycled there. And on the other acreage, there's 40 acres put into organic olive production. And then we're using the rest of the parcels, 5's going to grapes, and then we're using the rest for conservation. And really what we're doing is testing there. We're testing on multiple veggie row crops, no-till methods, biochar applications, compost applications. We're increasing the soil organic matter to increase the soil's capacity to sequester carbon, nitrogen, and increase the water holding capacity, all of the benefits that come across building a healthy soil. This was a degraded site, right? So this is an agricultural system, which means that humans came in, deforested, ran cattle, and then started dragging tractors over, disturbing the soil profile. And I guess the way that I think of it is like the substrate, right? There's all these spheres to the world, and then just above the lithosphere, the atmosphere, we got that really fine margin that's the soil, the substrate of life, right? The substrate of all of our plant communities, and that's kind of what we've been destroying in these agricultural systems. So it's the conversation came around to, it's like, okay, well, we know that we need to bring it back. We know that we need healthy soils. We need healthy soils to mitigate storm runoff, increase water quality, reduce irrigation needs, reduce cost of trying to have an operation that could, make revenue to sustain. All of these things came back to like, we need to rebuild the soil and rebuild the biodiversity. And so we met with the tribe, and really what we came up with is like, okay, look, how are we going to do this? We started engaging with state and federal programs, with individual funders, nonprofit funders, to see how we could do this. And we could stand on, right, like a mile high of scientific data that says like, this is what needs to be done. And we know from our traditional ecological knowledge that the biodiversity in the area and the management and the conservation of the soil and water resources takes tending. And so it's kind of interesting because we have all of that knowledge at hand, and it's just, how do we make it happen? And so we were testing for that, and all of the resources that it takes to come up with putting in the planting. Here, let me take a step back really quick. So I just remember what the panel topic was. So what we had to do, I told you guys I was going to go off track. There's not a steering wheel on this thing. Is we had to come up with a suite of species that was suited for our temperature and precipitation, our geographical location, that has 20-degree nights, that has 110-degree days at times, that has 80 mile per hour Santa Ana gusts. What could thrive here? What could survive here? And it's really the native plants that are growing about a quarter mile from the farm. And it's like, okay, well, what are we going to do? Could we introduce species here that might thrive better with more extreme drought? And so we came up with a plant list of the tribal working group, and through some of our partners in San Diego at Recon Environmental and the NRCS field biologist that works with us to come up with, define, like, kind of distill that list down and say like, okay, these are the species. And the main filter, which we used, and this is from, we seed drilled 40 acres of grasslands, and we planted 5,000 feet, hundreds of native trees and shrubs, and we stopped tilling the soil. And all of that, what our primary filter was availability, just to keep in mind. And so what we really focused on doing after implementing all of these practices is testing for that soil organic matter, the soil organic carbon, how could we increase it? Because when we through vegging this entire farm and stopped disking it and stopped turning the soil over and over again and revitalizing it so that it could bring all of these slew of benefits, we used the marker of the soil organic matter. And we saw that increase over 2 years to 1%. It went from 0.75, this is the average, up to 1.75. We want to bring it to 4%, which is the maximum, the threshold that we could reach for the soil's temperature and precipitation regimes. That's what we could reach. And for each percentage of soil organic matter increase, it increases the soil capacity to hold an acre foot of water. So we could, and yeah, if we really start to think about that and what that means for our landscape and our ecosystem, in this degraded ecosystem where water has been rushed off of the surface, it hasn't had the ability to percolate, that doesn't have those organic, doesn't have that microbial and bacterial, fungal, and plant exudates to make strong aggregates to hold on to water and to help even increase exponentially the carbon that could be pulled down. We just keep looking at that, and we used all of our knowledge to be able to try to do that, and we accomplished that 1% in a 2-year period. And so we were able to do that using native grassland species that are suited for this site and location, and we did that with our trees and shrubs. One of the most interesting things that happened in our test plots in our veggie row crops, in our no-till beds that has the highest soil organic matter, we had a day 2 years ago in summer in June. Temperatures peaked at 121 degrees. That's not that crazy for our region. It's not that far of a stretch. It's still a hot day, but what happened, the gradient went like that. And we lost life from our chickens. The majority of the crops in the ground just wilted and fell. Our hydraulics couldn't pull up water fast enough, even though all the water was on. What did do well was our no-till beds that could survive that, the ones that had the highest soil organic matter. And so, and the other thing that did well, of course, was the native plants in the area. There wasn't a lot of flagging. We're right in the heart of avocado country. The avocado country lost millions and millions of dollars in one day from that gradient spiking in that extreme event. And so we got to stand there and scratch our head. We looked at all of our test plots, all of our controls, and it was evident to see, it's like, okay, if we integrate as many species in that we could, any of our local native species, to increase the soil organic matter without applying too much water, without having to, do all of these tricks when you're dealing with exotic species, we're able to build a more resilient landscape, right? And also, and if we just transition to not breaking down the soil, not humans, not destroying the soil profile, we're able to have also a productive agricultural system.
Wow. So that's, I mean, that's like geeking out in the best possible way. with all that information. And
okay, am I still in the lanes here?
You're still in the lanes. You're still in the lanes, but I'm actually we've got tons of questions piling up. So first of all, I want to say that the project is amazing, and I love that what's coming out of it is that the native plants are the thing that are the most resilient, which brings me back to Charlie, and this relates to a question that's come up in the chat, and I think it's a really good one, which is that as our ecosystems are being impacted by climate change, the species that are going to thrive in those spaces is changing. So I'm paraphrasing the question somewhat, but it has to do with how do we define what constitutes a native species, and are we going to change those definitions in terms of our management so that perhaps rather than trying to continue to support species that aren't going to thrive under current climate conditions, maybe we introduce species that are now going to do well, but aren't traditionally a part of these ecosystems.
I saw this question in the chat, and I was really hoping that I would get to talk a little bit about it, because it really strikes at the heart of some really very profound concepts. First of all, Robin has identified correctly that the definitions of non-native and native are completely arbitrary, and we arrive at them by convention. And she's also identified another key concept, which is that human beings are not included in the calculus of what native and non-native is. So human beings evolved on this planet just like everything else, and if we take that for granted, then we have to assume that they are part of the system, and they are, and they have been. I really firmly believe that integration of people and into nature and into our conservation plans is totally key on a bunch of different levels. It's morally correct, and it's also there's no sustainability of wildland, natural land areas that are surrounded by hostile communities or by indifferent communities. Okay, so back to the question. I really do think that you're absolutely right. We need to, if we're going to plan for the future, if we're going to plan for resilience and sustainability in the future, we need to think about future conditions. And if we think about future conditions, it might be that certain species that are here now won't be able to thrive in those future conditions. I think we should try as much as possible to create space so that we don't lose biodiversity. And that's something that the zoo is working very hard on. And but I also think that we need to look creatively at ecosystems and think about what nature is and what natural is in a more creative way. A good example is that it ties again into this idea of native and non-native. When we do restoration, we set an arbitrary baseline at 1491, and that is the perfect ecosystem. All right, in 1491 here, first of all, there were tons of human communities, and they were integrated with the environment. They were modifying the environment, and there were grizzly bears, right? There were tons of grizzly bears, and the grizzly bears were modifying their environment. We can't. It's impossible for us to set those baselines and to try and achieve them. So we should set guideposts, right? Like the bumpers on a bowling alley, and then we can kind of pinball between them. And we should do that thinking, integrating climate scenarios and climate change into every aspect of what we're doing. Climate change is not currently the #1 cause of extinctions on the planet, but it is an aggravating factor to every conservation problem that exists. It aggravates, everything from wildfire to, social inequities. And that all feeds into the wildlands and the, human wildland interaction. So I've lost track of my question and the time.
That's okay. I mean, this is organic. We like our things organic. No pesticides in this discussion. But there are a lot of questions, so I do want to remind our audience that if we don't get to your question, apologies for that. We're limited in time, but you can always add your question to the Padlet little interface, and our panelists will get to look at those later and hopefully get an opportunity to answer them for you. But we have some good questions that circle us back to the border, and I want to bring some of those up a little bit to both Marina and Sula. And this question makes the comment that the border wall has economic and political aspects to it, and contrast it with what we see in Canada. That is also an international border, but nobody is raising a fuss about building a wall on the Canadian border. So what can you tell us about binational management, binational ecological management from, say, some of the binational parks that have crossed those borders with other countries? And on a tribal side of things, the Tohono O'odham Nation has a reservation and traditional lands that straddle the U.S.-Mexico border. You know, as they say, they did not cross the border crossed them. But do you have any examples of places where there's been cross-border collaboration in parks or in reserves, and what do you see as hopeful from that work? Mirna, we'll start with you. You're muted.
Sorry, I was in the Spanish channel.
Oh.
Well, I think for the information about the management, I think Sula can help me a lot with that topic. But I think in my part with educational services and community outreach and working with native people, in San Quintin Bay, there's a lot of people from different parts of Mexico. So we don't have like native people, like native people there. But here in Ensenada, where I live, we have a lot of native communities. So I think, again, the work that we do with different organizations and the support, it's very important for like preserve also and protect the lands of these native people. Yeah.
And Sula, do you want to add to that? And also perhaps the aspect of the border wall itself. What are the ecological implications of an actual physical wall?
Yeah, you know, it's a really great question, and I thank Horacio for really pointing out a solution in the question itself, which is, can we look to other examples around the world? Can we look to examples of Canada and the US? And I honestly think we can, as you mentioned, look to former examples along the US-Mexico border before it was being closed off. You know, so we have some really great anecdotes. And I think it's worth mentioning, and Charlie may know more about this than me, we both help organize the Border BioBlitz each year. And the last year we did it, there were actually correspondents from Korea looking at the North and South Korea border, and they were interested in models they could use. And so I think there's a big solution in this question, which is that we can look worldwide and talk about how we're doing things across all sorts of different borders, you know, and they don't even have to be international borders, but, you know, as you're mentioning, land management borders, all sorts of borders. And I'm losing track of the question, I'm sorry, but for the physical boundary, so for example, where we're working and we're trying to work across this border, there are challenges, not just with the migrations of species and the movements of species. The first thing we always think of is, what if certain animals can't walk the direction they were walking? And that is one of the challenges. But don't forget, you're also looking at now sort of a break in habitat connectivity that you didn't have before. You're also maybe looking at, suddenly there's lights on all night in a place that was previously pitch dark. Maybe our bat migrations aren't functioning in the same way. Maybe other animals that are nocturnal are not going to be moving in the same way. And so there's a disruption, even if the barrier doesn't impede your movement, and I think takes place. And then really the secondary impact that often is more of the management challenge, the one we can do something about, is that this disturbance then often allows lots of new species to come in, changes conditions. And so it's that break in connectivity, it's that disturbance to the ecosystem. And you know, we're having a really interesting discussion about native versus non-native species, but some species are aggressively invasive and they reduce biodiversity. And I think we're all agreed that those species should be targeted for removal, eradication, avoidance, whatever you can do, if you're able. And often it's too disruptive to even be done. But if we can keep them out of these areas that have been pristine, you know, that has to be a management focus.
And Megan, I see how emphatically you're nodding along to what Sula is saying. So what do you want to add to that?
I think she hit the nail on the head. I mean, it has numerous problems. You know, I'm also thinking like hydrologic flows. Anytime you throw hard barriers in the landscape, you get, you know, erosion and gullying and problems, and then that creates problems. I mean, this is all connected, right? The soil is connected to the plants, like Conor was talking about, or connected to habitat for the species. seed migration, it's not just animals, seed migrations, seed dispersal, all those things are affected. I mean, you are, by putting a hard boundary in the landscape, you are disrupting ecological processes in sort of a big way. And there's ways around it, to improve conditions, but, long story short, it has a severe impact, and it has a negative impact that is difficult to mitigate.
Absolutely. And now I'm thinking about my own backyard where I have 4 happy, fluffy, feathery chickens. And all night I have a little light that's on my back porch. It's a motion sensor, so it gets bright if something goes by it. But it's on all night. And now I'm wondering, how am I disrupting the ecosystem of my chickens because that light shines right on their coop? So maybe I need to turn off the light so that my chickens can have normal darkness in their coop. But that's just personal. So we're getting to the end of our time here. So I want to do the same as I did it with our first session and give each of you the opportunity to answer a question that Myrna actually already answered at the beginning about what gives you hope. So let me go back to Charlie and say, what gives you hope in your work?
I think I could sum up my, the whole ball of my hope in 2 kind of pithy concepts. So one is ecosystems are pretty resilient, and I personally think that it's really interesting to see to think of ecosystems as dynamic, and to kind of try and take away some of the value judgments that we make that have to do with pristine ecosystems versus disturbed, and appreciate some of the new interactions and interesting things that are happening. There are some species like coyotes, and in your backyard, maybe you might be disrupting a natural predator, predator prey community there with the lights, or not. Honestly, your lights are probably the least of their problems. But there are whole trophic communities that are springing up around these in peri-urban areas and in urban areas, and they're absolutely fascinating to think about. And then the other thing that gives me hope is how many people are passionate about the fact that we're here, and that this community is here, and that this community crosses borders, and how many people are passionate about and have devoted their lives to hashing out these issues and thinking about the future. So that definitely makes it a little easier to get up in the morning.
For sure. Conor, how about you?
So, I like to draw from, when I was listening to Hugh talk earlier, and he was talking about fire regimes, and we were talking about, the panel was discussing, how fire suppression has influenced the way we behave and the threats that we perceive, and what it's done to the forest and the sort of secession of the forest with. Anyways, and then touching on agricultural systems and the amount of disturbance that causes, and degradation to soil health, and how that impacts us from the shorelines to the top of the watershed. And we're talking about these physical boundaries that we keep building as well. And it reminds me, when I think all the time, and even when we're trying to implement conservation practices and come up with solutions, I just feel that there's a tremendous amount of knowledge that's already there. It's sitting on the table. There's easy access to it. There's funding on the table. There's technical resources on the table. The conversations have already been had, and it's just the implementation of the steps that need to be taken next, right? And to me, it all just boils down to, we have a tremendous amount of force in the environment, right? We're an immense force of everything that we bring, but we're also an immense force of coming up with solutions and answers, and changing the way we do things. And that gives me a tremendous amount of hope, because it tells me the only thing that really is inhibiting us from doing all the work that we need to do as humans is communication. And it's just being a humble listener and developing partnerships and synergizing. And that's so hopeful because it's so attainable. It could happen in a flash. And it feels like there just needs to be clicks that need to happen. And then we could, everything that we're dreaming and discussing today becomes a reality.
Yeah. So that we're actually tiny bit over time. So I want Sula and Myrna and Megan to just give me one word that links to hope for you. I know now you look terrified. So, you know, you can just say people or friends or art or kids or whatever. So Sula, you first.
You.
You. Perfect. Megan, what about you?
I think it's groups like the Climate Science Alliance. I was going to say the panel and people wanting to innovate. Ready
And
to
finally,
do the work.
Myrna, I'm going to let you give us the last word. And if you want, you can give it to us in Spanish because we all need to learn it.
I think, yeah, community, definitely. Thanks all of you. Thanks for think on me, think on Terra, and think in this side of the border. It's very, very important for us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everybody. And again, to our audience, if you want to put your question that wasn't answered into Padlet, hopefully our panelists will get to that. Be sure to come back in 1 hour for Building Resilient Communities. Thank you again. High fives, virtual hugs to all of our wonderful panelists, and go have some lunch and we'll see you in an hour.